All right, so today we're doing a deep dive into, well, the world of Muhammad Amarsi.
Yeah, yes.
And
You know.
I think some people listening might be thinking Muhammad who?
Right.
But
Yeah.
trust me, it's a fascinating story. We're talking someone who, I mean, this is a guy who's had dealings that touch the world of Putin. He's rubbed shoulders with Prince Charles. Like, how do you even...
He's everywhere.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing about Amersi that I think is so captivating, right? He's at this nexus of immense wealth, obviously, but also political power, philanthropy. He really embodies, I think, a lot of the complexities of influence in the 21st century.
Yeah, and our guide through all of this is Cuckooland, Where the Rich Own the Truth, by Tom Burgis.
Great book.
It's a fantastic look, a no-holds-barred look, I think,
Yeah.
at how Amarsi operates.
Yeah, Burgess does a really good job, I think, in this book of kind of pulling back the curtain on this world of, high finance and global influence and all that kind of, it gets interesting in this book for sure.
Yeah, so let's dive in. I mean, Amarsi starts his journey as a lawyer,
Right.
but he makes a pretty quick transition to the world of telecommunications consulting.
He does, yeah, and this is where things get interesting.
Yeah.
So early on in his career, he's doing a lot of work, a lot of deals in Russia, and he ends up crossing paths with this guy, Jeffrey Gallman.
Okay.
Now, what's interesting about Gallman is he later comes under scrutiny for allegedly being a front for Putin's own telecom minister.
Wait, so Amarsi is potentially involved with someone linked to Putin?
That's the question, right? Now, Amersi denies any knowledge of Gallman's, alleged ties. But what's fascinating is Burgis, he digs up some pretty interesting evidence that, suggests that maybe Amersi knew a bit more than he was letting on at the time.
It's like something out of a spy thriller.
It really is.
Okay, so you have these like shadowy dealings, but then you have this complete like shift, right?
Right.
Where Amarsi becomes this big-time philanthropist.
Yeah.
He ends up working with Prince Charles to restore Dumfries House. Like, talk about a plot twist.
It's a stark contrast, right?
Yeah.
On the one hand, you have this, shrewd businessman who's accused of some, let's just say, questionable dealings. And then on the other hand, he's rubbing elbows with, royalty. He's funding charitable projects.
Yeah, and get this. One of the things he funds is installing internet at Dumfries House.
Interesting.
Which, like, on the surface seems like kind of a small detail, but it's like, is he trying to drag these very traditional institutions into the 21st century?
Well, yeah, I mean, it speaks to a certain approach to philanthropy, right?
Right.
So you have to ask yourself, does his past taint his charitable giving? Or is this a genuine attempt to make a positive impact in the world?
That's what I'm grappling with this, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not just Dumfries House. Like, let's talk about his involvement with the UK Conservative Party.
Right.
This is not someone afraid to, open the checkbook,
Yeah.
donating pretty substantial sums. And as Burgis points out, that often gets you pretty close to top politicians.
Oh, absolutely.
Those exclusive events, that kind of thing.
I mean, this is a textbook example, if you will, of access capitalism.
Right.
Now, to be clear, there's no suggestion that anything illegal was done here, right? Amersi's donations were perfectly legal, but it certainly raises some ethical questions.
Yeah.
I mean, is he essentially buying influence?
It feels a bit quid pro quo-y, doesn't it? Like there's an access and favors being traded kind of, under the surface a bit.
Totally. And then you layer on top of that, he creates his own organization, Komena, right? Which is focused on Middle Eastern relations. It's almost as if he's trying to create like a parallel structure to the conservative Middle East Council,
Right.
which, you guessed it, leads to a bit of a power struggle.
And Amarsi, he doesn't really like it when people, especially within the Conservative Party, start asking questions about, his methods,
Right.
his past.
And this is where the legal battles come in.
Yes. So we have to talk about what goes down with Charlotte Leslie,
Oh.
who, for those who don't know, she's a former MP, and she ends up on the receiving end of a pretty intense defamation lawsuit from Amarsi after she raises concerns about some of his business dealings.
Yeah, what's interesting about this case is that it really highlights how libel law can be used as a tool, and I think a very effective and expensive tool, to silence critics, right? Especially for those who dare to, question or challenge the ultra-wealthy and the powerful.
Yeah, it's a lot harder to speak truth to power when you have these legal repercussions hanging over you.
Exactly.
Kind of a chilling thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
To think that if you have the resources, you can potentially silence any kind of criticism, control the narrative.
For sure.
Which is why, I mean, thank goodness for investigative journalists like Tom Burgis, who are willing to kind of like, wade into these murky waters and actually try to get to the bottom of what's going on.
I completely agree.
But okay, let's circle back to those early Russian dealings for a second.
Okay.
Because it gets a lot more complicated than just, Jeffrey Gallman potentially being connected to Putin's telecom minister. Like, this is where things get really, really interesting.
Right. So we're talking about this massive payment, right? Over $220 million.
$220 million. That's
From a telecoms giant, TeliaSonera, to a company in Gibraltar. And the question is, where is that money going?
Okay, don't tell me. Straight into the pockets of some corrupt official.
Yeah, you got it. Well, not directly an official. This is even shadier. We're talking about Gulnara Karimova, the daughter of Uzbekistan's dictator.
Okay, hold on. So, like, how does $220 million, how does it even happen? Like, how could a Mercy not have known where this money was going?
Well, that's what Burgis asks him, right?
Yeah.
And Mercy claims that he had no clue about the ultimate beneficiary, that it wasn't his job to know. He kind of deflects and says, the lawyers should have done their due diligence, the bank's involved.
Come on, we're talking about a guy who's made millions as a consultant. Like, he's supposed to be the expert in this field.
Right.
Something doesn't add up here.
And here's where it gets even more interesting, right? So Burgis, he keeps digging, and he uncovers evidence that directly contradicts this claim by Amirsi. He points to an investment bank report that Amirsi himself had actually seen, which explicitly states that, a stake in this company, Uzden Robita, which was the Uzbek mobile phone company involved, was believed to be held by affiliates of, you guessed it, Gulnara Karimova.
So he had to have some idea that something shady was going on.
Yeah, and it gets more blatant than that, right? Like, there are emails between Amirsi and Beksad Akhmedov, the guy who's actually running the Uzbek company, where they directly name Gulnara Karimova as the person who wanted a piece of the pie.
Okay, at this point, it's getting really hard to believe that he didn't know what was going on.
Right, and you see, this is what's so fascinating, right? These stories about power and influence, they often hinge on this question of, who knew what and when. And while I think it's important to say that Burgis's book doesn't definitively prove that Amirsi knowingly facilitated a bribe, it presents a very compelling case that he was, at the very least, willfully ignorant.
Right, he wants to be seen as this kind of, like, innocent bystander caught up in these really complicated deals, but the evidence suggests otherwise.
Yes, and it's a pattern, right? We see this throughout Burgis's book, this kind of claiming ignorance, deflecting responsibility.
Yeah, it's like this carefully crafted persona of the philanthropist to kind of overshadow these more controversial business activities.
It makes you wonder, right?
Yeah, it really does.
Is he a shrewd operator who's using philanthropy as this kind of PR stunt to, rehabilitate his image? Or is he a well-intentioned guy who maybe just made some seriously questionable business decisions?
And that's the question we're going to keep coming back to, but it's not just Russia, it's not just the UK, and as we'll see, the web just keeps getting more tangled from here.
Oh, absolutely. We haven't even touched on Amirsi's ventures in Nepal yet, which involve yet another controversial figure and a whole new web of political connections. Stay tuned.
All right, Nepal. It almost sounds peaceful. But knowing what we know about Amirsi's dealings so far, I have a feeling this is anything but a relaxing getaway.
Yeah, you're right about that. In Nepal, we see Amirsi playing a key role in this major acquisition by TeliaSonera. They were buying a mobile network called Hello Nepal, but the real story here is the owner, this businessman named Ajay Samargi.
Right.
Now, Samargi was no ordinary telecom CEO.
Right.
This was a man with deep political connections, particularly to the Maoist party that had recently come into power in Nepal.
Samargi, the kind of the poster child for what Burgis calls this new order in Nepal, right?
Yes.
Where these political connections basically equal wealth and power.
Exactly, yeah.
And Samargi was even, there were rumors that he was managing some of the party's finances, right? He was that close with Prachanda, the Maoist leader.
He was, yeah, they were very close. And this is where Amirsi's involvement really starts to set off some alarm bells. Because he sees Samargi's political ties as a golden ticket,
right,
a way for TeliaSonera to basically lock down its position in the Nepali market.
So it wasn't just about the value of the company itself.
No.
It was about who Samargi knew, those connections at the top.
Exactly. It was about getting in good with the people in charge. Classic Emercy, right?
Yeah, classic Emercy.
And you even see this in an email that Burgis uncovers where Emercy explicitly states that, having Samardzija with his political backing on their side would be crucial for TeliaSonera, especially to protect its existing network, Amarcel,
Right.
which was already worth $1 billion. Like, they couldn't afford to lose that.
It's almost like he was suggesting that if they didn't play ball with Samardzija, that he could easily use his influence to kind of turn against them.
Oh, absolutely.
And undermine Ansel, which is,
Yeah, I mean, it's a very clear example of how Emercy viewed political influence, right? It was a commodity, something to be, bought and sold, traded just like any other asset. In fact, he even goes so far as to arrange a meeting between TeliaSonera executives and Prachanda himself.
Wow. So it's, again, we're seeing this pattern with Emercy. He's like a magnet for these politically connected figures, and he uses those connections to kind of push through these deals. But then at the same time, he's still presenting himself as this, ethical philanthropist. It's audacious.
It is. It's this fascinating contradiction.
Yeah.
He occupies this space where business and politics and philanthropy are all intertwined. It really makes you question what his true motivations are.
Yeah, it makes you question the ethics of it all too, right?
Sure.
Like, it seems like he was willing to overlook some pretty serious red flags if it meant, securing a lucrative deal. Did Burgis get into that at all?
He did. He describes this one instance where Emercy's basically confronted about the rampant corruption in some of these countries he's operating in, and his response is fascinating. He basically argues that if Western companies want to do business in these places, they have to be willing to accept a certain level of corruption.
Oh, wow.
He even goes so far as to suggest that Western countries are being hypocritical for criticizing this corruption, while at the same time benefiting from the systems that enable it.
It's a very everybody else is doing it, so why am I the bad guy kind of argument.
Exactly. He sees these deals as just, the price of doing business in certain parts of the world, and he gets very defensive at any implication that he's acted unethically.
But isn't that a dangerous argument to make?
Yeah.
Because if we just accept that corruption is like the norm in certain places, aren't we just perpetuating the problem?
That's the ethical dilemma, right? At the heart of Emercy's story, and I think it's a question worth pondering. In a globalized world where the lines between cultures and economies are so blurred, how do we navigate these incredibly complicated ethical challenges?
Yeah, it's a tough one for sure.
Yeah.
But I think it's also important to remember that these deals, these kind of power plays, they have real-world consequences. And Burgis, actually, he tells the story of Behzad Akhmedov, the Uzbek businessman who Emercy worked with on that TeliaSonera deal.
Right.
What ends up happening to him?
So Akhmedov eventually falls out of favor with Gulnara Kerimova and ends up having to flee Uzbekistan, fearing for his life. He actually ends up seeking refuge in Russia, and he cooperates with authorities who are investigating the TeliaSonera deal.
Wow.
So he kind of spills the beans on Kerimova's involvement.
So the people that Emercy relies on to pull off these deals often end up as collateral damage when the power dynamics shift.
It's a tragic reality, but it's true.
Yeah, it's a reminder that there are real lives caught in the crossfire of these high-stakes games.
For sure.
Speaking of consequences, didn't Emercy face some, backlash himself after Charlotte Leslie raised her concerns?
He did. After Leslie sends these memos to various figures within the Conservative Party, including some with intelligence ties, Emercy's relationship with the party definitely cools. They launched an internal review of his donations, and he's even asked to take a step back from Komina.
Wow, so despite his efforts to kind of discredit her, it sounds like her memo did raise some red flags within the party.
It did. It ultimately led to Emercy suing Leslie for libel, which brings us back to that question of who gets to control the narrative.
Because it wasn't just Leslie, right? Didn't he also go after Catherine Bilton, the author who wrote that book about Putin's inner circle?
He did, yeah. He took issue with a passage in her book that mentioned his early dealings in Russia with Jeffrey Gallman,
right,
claiming it was defamatory, and he tried to pressure her publisher to pull the book.
This guy is serious about protecting his reputation, even if it means using, legal threats to silence anyone who dares to kind of question his version of events.
And that's one of the most important takeaways from Burgis's book, I think.
Yeah.
It exposes how the wealthy and powerful can weaponize libel law to suppress criticism and control the flow of information. It's a reminder that freedom of speech, especially when it comes to holding the powerful accountable, is constantly under threat.
It's a bit ironic, don't you think? Considering Emercy, in his own lectures, his own writings, often praises the role of investigative journalism in uncovering wrongdoing.
The irony is definitely not lost on Burgis, who points out that Amercy only seems to be a fan of a free press when it benefits him.
Right, classic case of wanting to have your cake and eat it too.
Exactly.
So what happened with that libel case against Leslie?
Well, in the end, the judge ruled in Leslie's favor, finding that her statements about Amercy were based on reasonable grounds and that she had acted responsibly in raising her concerns.
So despite his best efforts, he couldn't completely silence the questions surrounding his past.
He couldn't know. And I think that's a testament to the importance of a strong legal system, one that protects freedom of speech and ensures that those with wealth and power can't just operate with complete impunity.
It's still unsettling, though.
Oh, absolutely.
That he even tried to use the courts in that way to silence his critics. It speaks volumes.
It really does make you question his commitment to transparency.
Yeah.
But, let's move on from the courtrooms for now and head over to, wait for it, Kazakhstan.
Kazakhstan. Okay, I'm sensing a theme here. Who are we meeting in Kazakhstan? And what kind of dealings went down there? Give me the details. Kazakhstan. It seems like every time we turn a corner with Amercy, we end up in another country with another, let's just say, interesting character. Right?
Yeah, you're telling me. Kazakhstan is no different. This time, the spotlight falls on Aigul Nuryeva.
Okay.
Now, she was a prominent businesswoman, made a lot of money in Kazakhstan's telecom industry, but, you guessed it, her ties to the ruling regime, they raised some serious questions.
So more political connections, more blurring of the line.
Exactly. See, Nuryeva represents this trend that Burgis talks about that's become quite common in these, post-Soviet states, places like Kazakhstan.
Okay.
The rise of what he calls trusted representatives.
Trusted representatives. What does that even mean?
Basically, you have these individuals who are widely believed to be holding assets on behalf of powerful political figures.
Oh, I see.
It allows for this degree of plausible deniability, right, when it comes to their wealth.
So it's like hiding in plain sight, using someone else as a front.
Precisely. It makes it incredibly difficult to actually track the flow of money, right,
Right.
to really determine who is ultimately benefiting from these deals.
Right.
And in Nuryeva's case, there's evidence linking her to this guy, Karim Massimov, who was a close confidant of Kazakhstan's longtime ruler, Nursultan Nazarbayev.
Didn't Massimov, I think I read this somewhere, didn't he actually admit to some U.S. diplomats at one point that he had set up a company with Nuryeva in Singapore?
He did, yeah. And it gets better. Investigators who were hired by Tele2, which is another telecom company that had dealings with Nuryeva, they found all these business connections between her and Massimov. And their conclusion was that it was highly likely she was acting as his trusted representative.
So yet again, we're seeing Amercy involved in a deal where it's like, you can't tell where the business ends and the political power begins.
It's a feature, not a bug, of this world.
Right.
And just like clockwork, Amercy denies any knowledge of wrongdoing. Says he had no reason to believe that Nuryeva was a front for anyone. The deals were all above board, proper legal and financial advisors, the whole 9 yards.
But come on, given everything we've talked about, all the evidence that Burgis lays out, how many times can one person just say, I didn't know?
Well, and that's exactly what Burgis points out, right?
Yeah.
This is a recurring theme, this pattern of denial, deflection.
Right.
And it's a tactic, right? It's not unique to Amercy. It's something that the wealthy and powerful, they use it to protect themselves.
Yeah.
They rely on these complex legal structures, these opaque financial systems, carefully constructed narratives, all to shield themselves from scrutiny.
It's like they're living in a completely different reality.
It is a different reality, and that's what's so powerful, I think, about the title of Burgis's book, right?
Yeah.
Cuckooland.
Right.
It's this world where the rich and powerful, they create their own rules, their own reality, and often at the expense of everyone else.
Yeah, it's a bit of a terrifying thought, to be honest.
It is a concerning reality, for sure.
That those with immense wealth and influence can just kind of operate with impunity, shape the world to fit their own interests. It's, I don't know, it's a big dystopian, isn't it?
It really underscores the importance of investigative journalism.
Yes.
Right? Like, thank goodness for people like Tom Burgis, who are willing to dig deeper, follow the money, challenge these figures who would rather keep everything hidden from public view.
Yeah, it makes you really appreciate the courage it takes to stand up to these powerful figures, especially when, let's face it, they have the resources to silence their critics.
Oh, absolutely. It's never easy to speak truth to power, especially when that power is backed by significant wealth.
So as we try to kind of untangle this web of connections, these questionable dealings, these legal battles, what's the key takeaway here for our listeners? What should we be walking away with after this deep dive into the world of Mohamed Amercy?
I think more than anything, we need to be critical, right? We can't just take things at face value, especially when they're coming from those with power and influence.
Right.
We have to question the narratives that we're given. We have to demand transparency. And most importantly, we have to hold these figures accountable for their actions.
And support those who are brave enough to shine a light on those actions, even when it's uncomfortable.
Absolutely. Amirci's story, it shows us that the truth is often hidden in plain sight. So it's up to us to, to connect the dots, ask the tough questions, and really demand a system that prioritizes accountability.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with this final thought. In a world where philanthropy, business, and political influence are all becoming more and more intertwined, how can we ensure that power, no matter who holds it, is used responsibly and ethically?
It's a question we all need to be asking, and more importantly, demanding answers to.
Couldn't agree more.